Let's talk about Sydney and things you probably want to know before moving to the city. Let's get started. Sydney is located in the state of New South Wales and is one of Australia's largest cities, with a population of over 5 million people. Another thing that you may want to know is that Sydney is divided into different areas. First, we have Sydney City, which is basically the CBD area where you'll find most office buildings, but also very important landmarks such as the Opera House, the Westfield Tower, Darling Harbour, the Rocks area, and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, next to the CBD area, we have Inner Sydney, which basically refers to inner city suburbs like Surrey Hills. And these are very trendy suburbs, very gentrified and more on the expensive side because, of course, they are close to the city and are full of cafes, people. They're very, very lively. Now, then another area is Sydney East, which refers basically to Sydney's eastern suburbs. This is where you'll find Sydney's most popular coastal areas and beaches, such as Bondi Beach, Coogee. Whether you're there for a visit or you're going to stay there long term, I highly recommend checking out these areas. They're super, super beautiful, but of course, expensive. Now, if you travel past the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you'll find Sydney's northern suburbs, such as Manly, Dee Why, Palm Beach. These suburbs, again, because of their proximity to the beach and the coast, they tend to be pretty expensive. But of course, they're beautiful. And then, of course, you have Sydney South and Western Sydney. Here you'll find areas such as Parramatta. These areas tend to be a bit more affordable than the areas that I mentioned before because they're further from the beach and the city. So if you're looking for affordable options in Sydney, perhaps it's worth considering these areas. Now, as you can appreciate, Sydney is huge. So if you're planning to move to this city, I highly recommend doing your research to make sure that whatever you choose to live fits your lifestyle as well as your budget. Now, if you're watching this video, you're probably planning to come to Australia or perhaps you're already living here. If this is the case, you may want to hear about NordVPN, the sponsor of today's video. If you haven't heard, NordVPN is basically a service that keeps your internet connection private and secure because it hides your online activities from others by encrypting your data. So, for example, if you're traveling around Australia and you get connected to public Wi-Fi, NordVPN can protect you against online threats, malware, and any potential criminals trying to steal your data. So it basically keeps you safe. Another great thing about it is that with NordVPN, you can actually change your location and navigate websites as if you were in a different country. So for example, once you come here, you can watch TV shows from your home country that may not be available in Australia, or get better deals for international flights and hotels, or even navigate Australian websites that may be blocked in your area. So it's a pretty cool service. So if you want to try out NordVPN, the fastest VPN on the market, by the way, there is a link down below. And if you use that link, you'll get a special offer, which will give you 4 months extra on the 2-year plan. They also have a 30-day money-back guarantee if you change your mind. So thank you, NordVPN, for sponsoring this video. And now let's continue talking about Sydney. Now let's talk about working in Sydney. Considering that this is a huge city, for simplicity purposes, here I'm going to focus on the Sydney City and Inner South area. The most popular occupations in Sydney are people working in professional jobs, managers, clerical and administrative workers, technician and trade workers, and community and personal service workers. And the industries that employ most workers include professional scientific and technical services, healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, accommodation and food services, financial and insurance services. And speaking of industries, the ones that are experiencing the highest growth are professional scientific and technical services, education and training, construction, accommodation and food services, healthcare and social assistance. And something that you may want to know is that Sydney's unemployment rate is currently at 3.3%, which is pretty low. Now, in terms of salaries, something that you should know is that average weekly earnings for people employed full-time across the whole of New South Wales are 1,800 Australian dollars. Now let's talk about higher education in Sydney. The main universities in Sydney are University of New South Wales, the University of Sydney, the University of Technology Sydney, Macquarie University, Western Sydney University, Australian Catholic University, Charles Darwin University, and of course there's a bunch of other universities, but these are the main ones. Now, if you're an international student, you can expect to pay between 20k and 50k per year for your university fees. Lifestyle and cost of living. Now, in terms of housing costs, something that you should know if you're planning to move to Sydney is that this city has the highest rent costs in Australia, with the median weekly rent being around 711 Australian dollars. And of course, as we always say, your rent cost will vary according to where you live, that is your location, whether you live close to the beach, further from the beach, etc. So for example, renting a one-bedroom apartment in an inner city suburb in Sydney may cost you over 500 Australian dollars per week. Whereas if you go to areas further from the city, especially the west or south of Sydney, as we said before, rent becomes a bit more affordable and you may be able to rent a house for the same amount of money. So this is something worth considering. Beach and outdoors. Of course, as you may be aware, and this is probably one of the reasons why you're choosing to live in Sydney, is that this city is home to some of the most popular beaches in Australia. So if you're seeking a beach lifestyle, Sydney might be the city for you, but again, remember that this is very likely to happen if you live in inner city suburbs or the east or the north, which are more expensive. If you go to the south or west of Sydney, going to the beach might not be as accessible. So take that into consideration. Now, some of the must-see beaches in Sydney include Bondi Beach, Manly Beach, Bronte Beach, Watsons Bay, Palm Beach. And if you're visiting Sydney for the first time, I highly recommend doing the Bondi to Coogee Beach walk. Every time I go to Sydney, especially around the Opera House, because I love doing touristy things, I don't know, just being by the water, it makes me feel so happy. And yeah, Coogee and Bondi, even though they're full of tourists, for me, it's just such a beautiful area. I wish I was able to afford it. Yeah, so if you live around those areas, consider yourself very lucky. Now, if you're visiting Sydney, again, something else that I recommend doing is going to Watsons Bay. You just can hop on a ferry and it will take you to Watsons Bay, Manly, etc. And another thing, of course, is that if you're an outdoor lover, if you love doing sports, Sydney could be a really good option for you. From surfing to sailing to hiking to rock climbing in the Blue Mountains, you have lots of outdoor activities. I highly recommend visiting the Blue Mountains, especially. This is an amazing, super beautiful national park. And yeah, it's out of this world. You could also go to nearby coastal towns there in New South Wales, such as Byron Bay, Wollongong. In March, we had a wedding in an area near Newcastle. It was just beautiful. I didn't know that there was so much to see as well outside Sydney, right? It was just by the coast. The wedding was in a beautiful reserve. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, I highly recommend exploring a bit more. Now, cultural and recreational activities. Even though Sydney is very well known for its beach lifestyle, it does offer lots of cultural activities. So if you're into that, it's still a very good place to live in. From being able to go to the theater and watching plays at the Opera House, which is extremely beautiful, to annual festivals such as Vivid Sydney or Sculptures by the Sea and so many others. And even if you live in other Australian states, I highly recommend going there and checking out those festivals. It's worth it. Now, another thing that I highly recommend doing if you come to Australia, again, whether it is as a tourist for a short visit or if you're staying here temporarily or permanently, is to go at least once to the New Year's Eve fireworks show. I've been once. It was like a party opposite the Opera House and it was so beautiful. I think I even got a bit emotional because usually you watch it on the TV. It's one of the most popular shows globally, I guess, when it comes to New Year's Eve. So if you have the opportunity to do so, do it. It's super touristy, but I don't know. Personally speaking, I think it's worth it. And I think that you can do is to walk around, especially in the Sydney area. If it's your first time visiting Sydney, you can walk around the Botanic Gardens. It's beautiful. If you have kids, you can take them to the Luna Park, which is a theme park. Basically, it's next to the Harbour Bridge. If you like cycling, I highly recommend hiring a bike and cycling over the Harbour Bridge. Yeah, and just exploring the city by bike. In that case, it's super accessible. It's pretty easy to get around. And other cultural activities that you can do in Sydney include going to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Museum of Contemporary Art, or you can even book an Aboriginal guided tour experience to learn more about the culture and history of the traditional custodians of this land. So as you can see, there are many cultural activities in this beautiful city. And again, if you are local and you have other recommendations, please leave a comment below. Now let's talk about the most exciting topic of all, public transport. Getting around Sydney by public transport is pretty easy, in my opinion. Again, this includes the inner city areas, and you have a range of options. You can take the train, buses, trams, or ferries. And the system is very simple. You can get the Sydney Public Transport card, which is called Opal, or you can just pay with your phone, which is what I usually do. It's a shame that it hasn't been rolled out in other states. For example, in Melbourne, we still need the Mikey card, but in Sydney, you can just pay with your phone. So super convenient. Now, if you're planning to go to outer areas in Sydney, or even if you decide to live in those areas, public transport could be a good choice, but it will take you a considerable amount of time. And if you want to go on road trips, it's very likely that you're going to need a car. Remember that distances here in Australia are very long. Having said that, if you decide to live, I don't know, in Wollongong, you can easily take the train to the city, and that's what many people do. And I've done it every time that I go visit some relatives of my partner there. We take the train from Wollongong to the city, and it's super easy. But yeah, I guess it depends on the person. Many people, what they do is they drive their car to the train station, they park it there for the day, and then they take the train and go to work. And this is also a good alternative if you don't want to get stuck in traffic as well, in morning traffic. So in summary, is it worth moving to Sydney? In my personal opinion, Sydney is an amazing city for families, students, young professionals, backpackers, basically everyone. And indeed, as I showed you in this video, it's a truly amazing city that offers a lot of activities for everyone, but especially those who love the outdoors and the beach lifestyle. Now, having said that, Sydney is super expensive when it comes to renting. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. If you can't afford living in the eastern suburbs or the northern beaches and a beach lifestyle is what you're looking for, then I would definitely recommend looking for other alternatives in other Australian states. Because realistically, if you can't afford living in these suburbs, then you're going to have to live in areas much further from the beach, and you're going to have to spend a lot of time commuting and basically sitting on your car. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure if it's worth paying the price. Now, if you come to Australia and you get a job in Sydney, and basically Sydney is the only city that offers job opportunities in your industry, then of course, go ahead and come to this city. Now, another thing that I want to say is that, as I showed you, Sydney is huge. So the configuration of the city itself makes it very hard for people to really move around in terms of traveling long distances. So what tends to happen for people living in Sydney is that they end up living in their city hubs or suburbs, and they rarely leave those areas unless it is for work, for example. So many Sydneysiders, what they usually tell me is that it's like living in your own bubble, and that's amazing, of course, if you have your friends, etc. But otherwise, again, traffic and having a car is something that you do need to take into account if you're planning to move to this city. So in summary, yes, I do think it is worth moving to Sydney as long as you are able to afford it. Otherwise, again, I would suggest exploring other alternatives in other Australian cities. Now, if you'd like to watch more videos like this about living in Australia or other Australian cities, watch these videos here and here. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to keep supporting the channel so I can keep bringing more content for you. And I'll see you next time. Bye.